Demonic forces are at the forefront of many people's fears. True evil manifest in a most insidious form. I hope you're ready, as it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. The devil is known for his patience. He will see a ripening sin in our youth and wait all the long years of our life before the harvest. And why shouldn't he? What is one more soul to the untold billions in his dominion? What is one more year in the infinite span of his corrupted reign? Perhaps by waiting, he is even giving us a chance to spend our lives repenting for what we've done. But I wouldn't know. Sins such as mine are so terrible that no absolution is possible. So I suppose there was no reason for him to wait. He came for me in the woods while the mutilated woman I killed was still in my arms, warming my body with her blood. It's strange that I cannot remember why I even killed her, or even who she is. But this feeling of guilt so permeates my being that I would have walked to hell myself if I had known the way. I will not waste effort describing the devil. The impoverished words at my disposal have only been designed for this material world. Even as he stood before me, he was more removed from my understanding than the glorious sun was to a blind worm. It is suffice to say that he could not be perceived with any one of the senses, but the pressure of his presence so commanded my consciousness that I was aware of nothing else. Escape was impossible. Words were meaningless. I let this woman slip from my arms and stood to face him with all the dignity remaining to a man so removed from God. When he turned from me and began to walk through the fading light of this dying world, I kept pace with him and did not turn to either side. Where we walked, I do not know. But it seemed as though he could have relived my entire life in the time it took for him to stop. As long as he was beside me, I could not make sense of what else might be. Even the thoughts in my head and the temperature on my skin were insignificant to his companionship. As terrifying as it was to know my fate, I had found certain tranquility in the mindless journey at his side. Now that I could feel him begin to depart, however, my mind revolted, as though starting from a nightmare. I forced out the first thought I could muster to delay his departure. Who was she? You will suffer more if you do not know. And he was gone. And with him, the curtain lifted within me to reveal the horror of his empire I now found myself mirrored within. Perhaps it would be more accurate to call hell a person than a place, however, considering the unceasing sentient screams which pummeled me from the land itself. Writhing shadows sensitive to the touch, grasping endlessly at me with hands that were not hands. Endless cities sprawled before me as open wounds upon the rotting corpse that I stood upon. The sky was unobstructed by stars. Instead, vaulting endlessly into a timeless abyss. And looking at it, I experienced the ghastly sensation of balancing on an eroding precipice, which poised to tumble me endlessly into its yawning void. Charnel winds slithered their way into my nose and mouth, with tangible substance, forcing me to let oiled coils like writhing serpents penetrate my lungs with each breath. Beyond the cities in the distance rose the obscured ghost of monstrous beings and gods who roared in endless decay, which fate had forgotten them to. Through this blasphemous temple, to the end of the universe I went, cowed constantly by half-conceived winged terrors, which beat the air with a sound like the ceaseless web bludgeoning of fists on flesh. There are two kinds of pain which I had come to expect from the world of the living: the physical and the emotional. Never had I experienced a physical pain so excruciating as the boils which began to swell across my body, nor the mental burdens as debilitating as the taunting echoes which sneered at me from the living tissue beneath my feet. Every good memory of my life was poisoned against me, and each shame and guilt was mangled 1,000 times over by the leering spectators which narrated my ordeals with intimate knowledge and exaggerated effect. Worse than either was the spiritual pain I endured, however. The gnawing hopelessness and depression which robbed even my sense of self. I was not a person in hell. I was hell. I did not feel pain. I was pain, inseparable and indistinguishable. It was then, in the lowest reduction of my humanity, as I crawled across the putrid ground in a trail of my own ruptured boils, that she took pity on me. Gentle hands shed my skin from me, not as a torment, but as a release. My disfigured limbs were cut away by her flashing knife, each slice bringing a pain so pure and clean that I welcomed it without question. Layer by layer, she flayed me, until at last there was nothing left to cut but my soul. Again, it is difficult to describe her without the resilience of my moral senses, now stripped from me. But if you understood me when I told you that I was pain, you will understand again when I tell you that she was beauty. My husband was wrong about you, she told me. You didn't kill anyone, and you don't deserve to be here. I'm going to help you escape. I couldn't comprehend how anything could exist outside of this. What universe would accept me, as torn and broken as I was? What universe could accept, knowing it had the capacity to so punish an innocent soul? I don't deserve it. What left of me, I replied. I know I killed her. It's something you can never cut from me. She killed herself by loving you, and for that, you are not to blame. Do you see these hands? When she cupped my hands in her own, I knew she was creating them as she spoke. Clean, strong hands, untouched by the blemishes of hell. These hands could never be used for hurt. These eyes could never look upon such evil as its own creation. I didn't even have a face before she spoke, but my entire body was growing with each word. It was as though the seed of my soul was sprouting new life. Shards of bone lanced out and flourished with muscles like thickening bark. Organs dropped and swelling like ripening fruit, and the network of veins and arteries blossomed towards her as though seeking nourishment from the sun. Through the macabre landscape we sped, dancing across the festering world as softly as light through a drop of water. I could see her more clearly, and further we traversed, although she never stayed still long enough for me to get a proper look. Bare feet, skipped across the rotten land and twirled her through the looming spectres which besought us on all sides. It is a wonder that the oppression of this unending night had failed to extinguish her spark, and invigorated by the purity of her wake, I was holding him. You are his wife, then? It was difficult to speak to her as we raced, but I managed to slip in a few words every time I was able to draw near. We are bound to each other, yes, she replied. And then she was gone again, leaping fearlessly between fragile grips as she vaulted upwards. I followed her, up the tortuous broken hands the size of hillsides, which stretched vainly from the ground towards the vacuous sky. Of all the madness in this cursed place, that must be king. My husband is not mad, and neither am I for being with him, she replied. She was pulling herself up, through the fingers now, stopping to wait for me atop one of their monstrous joints. And if I were to love you instead, I asked, would that be mad as well? She smiled at me and stretched her slender hand to help me clamber up beside her. We sat together, staring upwards from the bottom of an endless sky, the slightest brush of her leg against my own intoxicating me with rapture. All love is paradoxically mad, she replied. It is an assault on reason, but in doing so it creates its own reason. But it won't do any good, because this is where you have to leave. And will you leave with me? She shook her head. You can't prefer to stay here. She nodded, saying, but you are free now, and that is what matters. All you must do is jump from this point, and with the body I have given you, you will be able to fall all the way back until you've left hell altogether. I've already left hell, I said, since the moment you found me. And if I were to leave you here, then I know wherever I found myself would be hell again without you there. You are being silly, wasting time. If my husband finds you with me, he won't, because you're coming with me. I cut her off, preferring not to dwell on the thought of being found. I can't. I made a promise. Then I can't either, and that's my promise to you. To prove my point, I even slipped down the finger we sat upon and began crawling backwards towards the massive palm. Stop it! If he'll find you, he'll what? I shouted back. What can he possibly do that he hasn't done already? I saw in her something I could not live without, and she must have seen something in me that she could not let die. I hadn't even made it back to the giant palm before her hands clasped me and heaved me back onto the twisted finger. We stood there for a while longer, together, hand in hand, staring up at the terrifying fall. Then the wet bludgeoning drums of the winged creatures began, and I could feel the tension wash through her body. I watched her, although she could not meet my gaze, and just the drumming began to close in around us, I felt her coil to leap. We jumped together, flying and falling simultaneously, in a dizzying tumble. The massive hand snatched at us as we began to depart, but it was too slow to prevent our liberation. The entire world screamed with more agony than could be contained. But though the lands reverberated with its echoes, even this deafening cacophony was quickly falling behind. The gut-clenching freefall distracted my attention, but I never let go of her hand as we whirled through the timeless void. It wasn't until the initial exhilaration began to fade when I could tell that something was wrong. I didn't have to look at her to feel her hand withering in my grasp, her skin wrinkled and dried as though years of heat began into it. Her skin wrinkled and dried as though years of heat beat into it with every second we passed together. Soon it began to crack and bleed, washing me with her warm blood. While I still felt healthy and strong, I was forced to watch with helpless terror as her body was devastated by the passage through the void. Her smooth hair began to mold and free fall in greasy clumps. Her face was torn, as though blasted by relentless sand, and though her fingers clutched onto me ever more desperately, I could feel the strength fleeing from her. No tormented hell could match the guilt, knowing she was enduring this for me. As the spinning abyss began to slow, I was able to swim through the air and clutch her onto me, cradling her in my arms as her body continued to deteriorate. Blood was now flowing freely from 1,000 sourceless wounds. When finally the black sky relinquished us back into the woods where I began, I was soaked in her blood and my own freely falling tears. Staring at her mutilated form, she was completely unrecognizable from before. My head was clouded, as though freshly waking up from a dream, and though I tried to hold on to the details, they were stolen from my mind with an inexorable decay. Soon I could not even remember who I was holding, or how she'd gotten there. All I knew is that it was my fault, and the weight of the guilt which her death bade me carry. When the devil came for me again, I knew I would follow him willingly, no matter what horror lay in store for me. I knew I deserved it for what I had done. I just wanted to get home that night. An impromptu board meeting ran late, and I had to stay until almost 9 p.m. just to take notes. When I finally did get out of there, waiting for the elevator was absolute torture. My heels were killing me, my bra was a dagger in my back, and all I had to show for my hard work was a legal pad full of insane political drivel and off-colored jokes. 5-10 minutes before the door opened, inside, a pair of giggling teenagers were shoving each other back and forth. One girl, one boy. Baggy hoodies, ripped jeans. They smell as though marijuana was a perfume. It didn't take a legal secretary to guess they had been playing an elevator game by pushing every button. I thought about reprimanding them, but the moment I stepped inside, they went dead quiet. Maybe they knew they were busted. The building should have been on lockdown by now anyway. I don't even know how they even got in here, but as my energy was so depleted, I didn't really care. "Where are you going?" I asked, just to be polite. The boy started to giggle again for a second, then stopped. So abruptly, I almost thought I was imagining it. It looked like the girl was holding her breath. She hid her face beneath her hair and went to push floor 1. Not my kids, not my problem. What was my problem is the elevator was going up instead of down. I moved towards the row of buttons, and the girl fell flat on the floor and scrambled out the way like I was made of lava. I mashed the highlighted number 1, but we were going up quicker than ever. Faster than it had ever gone before. There was nothing to hold on to, but I had to press myself to the back of the wall from falling over. It was shaking now too, buckling back and forth as it screeched up the cable. The lights flickered, and a cold wind started to whistle through the cracks in the doors. It wasn't like a storm or anything though. It was more like all of the heat in the elevator was flooding out into the shaft. Another lurch, the hardest one yet. I fell straight on my ass. The kids playing the elevator game were holding onto each other and managed to remain standing. But even after we'd stopped, they kept clinging on, as though holding on for dear life. The number 1 button went dark, and number 10 turned on. Slowly, ponderously, as though it was struggling against a near insurmountable pressure, the door slid open. I started to stand, then slipped again as one of my heels snapped clean off. I took the other shoe off, so frustrated that I just threw it at the kids. "Now look what you've done, you've broken the bloody elevator." The boy glanced in my direction, but immediately turned away again. They were straining to look outside, but terrified to get close to me. Good, they should be scared. Vandalizing a legal office was a stupid thing to do, as stupid as picking a fight in a police station. "I want your names, your IDs, both of you," I snapped. "You will be held responsible for any damages incurred, as far as the trespassing is concerned." But they still wouldn't look at me. The boy grabbed the girl by the hand and darted out the hallway. I couldn't just let them run havoc. "Hey you! You can't go in there!" I had to run to keep up now. "That's Mr. Bogle's office, you aren't allowed to." Of course, I patted myself down for my cell phone, but it wasn't there. I must have dropped it when I fell in the elevator. I half turned back, but the door was already closing. I took a step in the direction, but then I heard something crash from the office. I spun again, sprinting down the hallway in my bare feet. The boy was sitting on Mr. Bogle's desk, while the girl stared out the window. "Look at the sky," she said, "and how tall the buildings are." "Dude, this is crazy," he replied. Either they were stoned out of their minds, or it wasn't just marijuana. They were running their hands over everything, so I wouldn't have been surprised if they were rolling too. The boy was even poking the potted plant like it was some alien creature he had never seen before. "That's enough!" I roared. Finally, they both looked at me, and at each other, and then back at me. Did they regret playing this stupid elevator game yet? "Let's get out of here." The boy rammed straight through me with his shoulder, sending me spinning back to the ground. The girl was trying to jump over me now, but I managed to grab her by the ankle and drag her down. She thrashed melodramatically on the ground for a few seconds, but before I could get to my feet, she planted a kick in my face and broke free. The door was already closing by the time I got to my feet, and they were both inside, staring at me with wide, trembling eyes, as though they were somehow the victim in all of this. I felt absolutely feral as I lunged at them. I managed to get my fingers in the cracks before the elevator closed, and the sensor reflected the door was open wide. Half a dozen buttons had already been pushed, glowing like one big middle finger. The final stage of the elevator game had been played. They were cowering in the corner as I loomed over them, an inferno of retribution burning in my eyes. Fine, let the elevator take the long trip down. That was just longer for them to be trapped in there with me. Now they couldn't run. The struggle was absolutely pitiful. The boy's throat was almost comically fragile, and I was amazed how little pressure I needed to ram my broken heel through it. The girl was almost gone by the time I got to her, withering to a husk in seconds after the venom from my nails coursed through her legs where I had grabbed her. I got out of the elevator at the bottom, straightening my dress. I found my phone again and fixed my hair after snapping the other heel off my shoe. I was able to look almost presentable again. I thought I could finally go home after all of that, but it didn't take long to realize that I'd never been further from home in my life. What strange green plants they have here. The dark blue sky was nothing like the purple and orange we have at home. No wonder they were so surprised by everything in my world. If everyone here is so fragile as these two little ones, then I think I'm going to have a lot of fun here. Me and the guys were just doing a sweep of an old oil refinery when I found the eggs. I guess they liked the heat, because they were all clustered right around the fractal distillation chamber, which gets up past 720 Fahrenheit, when the crude oil is being heated up. The whole building was scheduled for demolition though, and it was our job to make sure the place was cleaned out. "Anyone want a souvenir?" I shouted. Guess the crew was in the other parts of the building. The eggs were about the size of my fist, all black and covered with thick bristles, like an especially paranoid cactus. Only one of them was really even intact. Maybe it's because the refinery hadn't been running in a while, that 5 out of the 6 eggs were cracked and leaking some kind of thick, rotten-smelling jelly. I was more motivated by the clock than curiosity, though, and I was about to mark the room as clear when... "A souvenir? Want a souvenir?" The voice was muffled and frail, but it was definitely coming from inside the egg. I crouched down next to it, scooping up the tiny ball in my worker's gloves. "So what are you supposed to be?" "Supposed to be," was all that it chirped back. Yeah, maybe it was the fumes in this place getting to my head, but there was something profoundly sad about that little echo. I dropped the egg in my pocket of my overalls, intending to show it off to everyone at the pub after work. Intending being the key word there. We didn't finish clearing the place until almost 6, and then there was a last-minute permit issue that had me driving around collecting signatures until past 9. I was dead tired and so ready to collapse at home that I barely remembered the weird egg in my pocket. If it wasn't for the little spikes, it would have been forgotten entirely. It must have liked my warmth though, because it seemed to keep trying to huddle closer to me in my pocket. When I got home and put it on the counter, I could actually hear a soft rattle as its spines shivered against the tile. "You got a name?" I asked it. You got... Can't you say anything more?" "I'm Phil." "You got a Phil." That's all it could do. Echo me. Was I weirded out? Yeah, sure. But it was cool too. I felt like a hero for saving it, and I guess I was feeling protective, because I hated watching it tremble like that. I put the thing on an oven rack and set it to 100 Fahrenheit, keeping the light on and checking on it occasionally. "Any more, Phil? Anything more?" Just still an echo, but it felt like there was more deliberate thought behind it. The voice was getting stronger, but it was still shivering. I turned the heat up, incrementally, and it continued to encourage me until I hit the max temperature of 550. I figured that if it could survive being pressed up the fractional distillation chamber, then it could survive this too. The egg seemed to be loving it, sure enough. "Supposed to be, thank you, Phil." I never remembered saying thank you, but it could have picked that up whilst listening to me from inside my pocket. I was only intending to let it bake and warm up for a little while, but I was so tired that I just fell asleep on the couch, watching TV. "Phil, Phil, Phil, Phil!" Shrill, insistently urgent. The first sound I heard when I woke up, still half asleep. I raced to the oven and turned on the light. Thick black jelly was dripping through my oven rack. Had I accidentally killed it? I opened the door and a wave of sulfuric air brutally forced itself into my nose and down my throat. I gagged and reeled back, desperately searching for an oven mitt to save the little guy. The shell had been shattered into a dozen pieces, and there was nothing inside but the charcoal goo. "Phil, over here! Look what I found!" It wasn't dead, it was hatched. and it was peeking out from my cupboard with a bottle of seasoning in each hand. Wide red eyes without pupil or cornea took up the entirety of its face. Black skin with green fuzzy splotches like fresh moss. 2 long fingers on each hand, with little mouths on each end of it, which it was speaking from. I wasn't afraid of it or anything, but shit was I surprised. It had already formed a perfect circle of spilled herbs and spices on my counter. There was a wide assortment of opened bottles and jars that would stick its fingers into before deciding whether to spill the contents into the circle or not. "Stop that, you're making a mess." Phil, it's a circle, Phil." It squealed with pride. "What the hell are you?" The hell you," it mimicked in a voice which was obviously a crude impersonation of me. I spent the next 20 minutes chasing it through my apartment, trying to trap or corner it somewhere. Of course, the little bugger thought it was just a game, and squealed and giggled with delight as it evaded my grasp over and over. I briefly considered calling my landlord, but somehow this seemed like something that would end up adding to my next rent payment. I was already late for the demolition though, and I couldn't fool around forever. Eventually, I lured it back into the oven where it seemed almost comfortable and slammed the door tight. I used a bike lock to secure the oven shut and cranked the heat down to 220 and left for work. I was worried about leaving that thing in my apartment till morning, but I managed to sneak off on my lunch break, race home and check on it. Just seeing that my building hadn't burned down or anything was a bigger relief than I realized. Then there was a palpable tension as I opened my door, half expecting my place to be torn to shreds. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Even the oven was still closed, although the bike lock was on the ground and it had been turned back up to 550. I took a deep breath and turned on the oven light. Jumping back, I saw the wide red eyes blinking in sluggish contentment on the other side of the glass. No harm done. I fastened the lock back on, this time pushing a heavy recliner to block the door as well. Imagine my surprise when I saw the creature hiding under the chair I was moving, or the bump from inside the cupboards, or the squealing giggles coming from my bedroom. I counted at least 6 of them before my lunch break was over, and the more I searched, the more circles I began to find. On the carpet, in the closet, on top of the TV, little circles of herbs and spices. And when they ran out of those, they improvised with whatever they could get their hands on. Mustard, mayonnaise, crumbled chips. There must have been 100 circles in my place. Meanwhile, my phone was ringing every 5 minutes. The demolition crew yelling at me, wondering where I was. I couldn't leave them in here. God knows what they get up to. I couldn't stay to watch them either though. I just opened a window and did my best to chase as many of them out as I could. They seemed bigger than they were this morning, almost the size of my head now, and their strong fingers had no trouble scaling down the brick building to escape. Anything more, Phil? Perhaps that was the original one, but I couldn't tell for sure. It clung to the outside of my building, hesitating to look back at me. Supposed to be happy here, Phil. Supposed to be home. My phone was ringing again, so goddamn impatient. Answering with one hand, I grabbed a broom in the other to push the creature further away from the window, hoping the rest of them would find their way out when they were ready. I followed the siren call of my cell phone and went back to work. That was the last time I've seen one of them, and I guess I should be thankful for that. But I'm not. I could tell something was seriously wrong when I was still a few blocks away from home. A dozen trash cans were lined up in the center of the road, and I had to get out of my car to move them. All the trash had been removed, and it was spread on either side of the cans in the shape of a long, evenly curving line. When the trash had run out, it was replaced with anything and everything to continue the unbroken line. broken wood, loose bricks, stolen bikes, and streetlights, all jumbled together. It just looked like a giant mess here. But I bet if I looked from the air, it would be shaped like a perfect circle. 2 or 3, maybe half a mile wide. Please, tell me that's not another summoning circle. You can feel Missy enter a room before you see her. The ambient sound of the college classroom dissolve when she speaks. All the raucous shouting and laughter-filled, muffled, besides the softly spoken melody of her voice. She wears light and shadow with equal grace, every angle making her appear as though she were posing for the painter's canvas. From the depths of her eyes to the supple curve of her body, Missy was a walking captivation. She was a dream, and I, her dream. But it was all too soon that I had to wake. She called me the night before she died, an event I've kept private until now, out of its sheer impossibility. She'd been absent from class a week before that, but now she spoke fast, rattling off a string of letters, demanding that I write down everything. I was scrambling to keep up, unable to ask questions. 20 letters total, ranging from A to D. They want more from me than I can give, she explained in a breathy rush. I have to go now. Memorize it, okay? You'll understand when they take you. The line went dead, and I couldn't reach her again. She wasn't in class the next day. Our psychology professor announced that she met with a fatal accident, refusing any further details. No one else seemed to care, but each passing day, I felt the burning of her empty chair in front of me. All I could do was memorize the list she gave me, and wait, hating myself for not doing more to get to know her while I had the chance. Then came the test. Just think of it as a survey, Professor Russell said, distributing the papers. Do your best and don't worry. It won't affect your grade. It's just a little experiment for the department. The impossible test. Indecipherable characters. Enigmatic equations. Utter nonsense. Students were looking around and starting to laugh. Professor Russell smiled indulgently, just urging us to take our best guess. The only thing that seemed familiar was the Scantron answer key. 20 questions, 20 letters. Coincidence or not, I filled them in from memory. I could feel the professor's eyes lock on me as I wrote with purpose, but I didn't care. I was consumed with the mystery of Missy's disappearance, savoring this last connection before she faded from the world altogether. Tests were collected, but I could tell the only paper the professor was interested in was mine. His keen eyes kept flashing between my test and my face. Then he excused himself to go to the bathroom, fishing out his phone as he left. I took the opportunity to follow. I've got another one from my class. Professor Russell was talking on the phone, his back to me as he walked. Perfect school, just like Missy. I tried to get closer to hear the voice on the other end, but the professor heard me and turned around. Going somewhere? He asked, pressing the phone against his chest. bathroom, I grunted, rushing ahead, feeling his eyes on me all the way down the hall. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, patiently waiting for when I got out. "We need to talk, Elijah." His voice was flat and dark. How did Missy die? I hadn't meant to blurt it out, but there it was. It had been on the tip of my tongue for so long that I'm surprised I even lasted this long. The professor arched his eyebrows, studying me. "She isn't dead." "Not exactly. I can take her to you if you want, but you might not like what you see." The professor wrote something on a notepad and handed it to me. "Midnight, room 031. Pack a suitcase." "The psychology building?" I asked. I didn't know the rooms went below 100. He pressed a key into my hand before turning back towards the classroom. "This will let you into the basement." "Oh, and Elijah." He glanced back as he opened the door. "You might want to make an appropriate excuse to your friends and family. They won't be seeing you again for a while." Missy and I were never close before the night she called me. Our relationship was little more than collaborating on the occasional assignment, or exchanging a covert smile across the room. Is it possible to love someone when you don't know the first thing about them? Regardless, I was impotent against my overwhelming curiosity. Professor Russell's doubtlessly counted on that purposefully, withholding details to bait his hook. It seemed so obvious looking back, but at the time, I couldn't think of anything besides the frantic desperation in Missy's voice. She needed me somehow, and that's all I needed to know. If only I had known what waited for me, then no compulsion, mortal or otherwise, could have made me step through that door. Instead, I was outside the room 5 minutes before midnight. I called my family to let them know I was accepted into a foreign exchange program and that I might be out of touch until I got set up there. I felt the strangeness of the place the second I opened room 031. A descending stairway cut deeply into the ground. Steps and walls hewn from large uneven stones that would better be suited to a medieval castle than a university. I had to use my phone as a flashlight, laboriously struggling my suitcase behind me. The stairway terminated in what could only be described as a wall of flesh. Torn skin so tight as to be almost transparent, stretched from wall to wall. The outline of faint blue veins was pulsing rhythmically beneath a single great eye. Almost a foot across was embedded the center. It blinked at me as I approached. A small stool was placed in front, with a serrated knife resting on top. Another note with my professor's handwriting read, "Continue until you can go no further." The door I entered at the top of the stairs slammed shut, and I jumped at the sound. I pushed the feeble flashlight of my phone as far up as the stairs as it would go, but it couldn't reach the top. If someone had entered behind me, then I wouldn't know. "Hello?" My voice cracked like it hadn't done since puberty. I picked up the knife and turned back to the wall of skin. The eyes strained wider, staring at the blade in my hand. The whole wall began to violently tremble, goosebumps even appearing on the surface. I slowly set the knife back down watching the wall visibly relax as I did so. Footsteps on the stairs. "Hello?" I tried again, stronger this time. "Quiet," hissed a male voice from the darkness. "We'll go further if they don't see us coming." Black eyes greedily caught my pale light. The boy who entered my illumination was about my age, probably no more than a college sophomore. Bumping along behind him came his own suitcase, considerably larger than my own. "Did you pass too? What's going on?" I asked. "You should know if you read the test. We've been accepted to the MC Academy." "MC?" I stared in open confusion. "Mortal Coil." A flash of sneer as he pushed past me. He grabbed the knife from the table, and I flinched. "How do you not know this? We're going to demon school." "You mean a school that teaches demons? Or a school that teaches... What are you, stupid? You couldn't have even read the paper if you didn't have demon blood in you." I opened my mouth to ask more, deciding instead to hold my tongue just in time. Somehow, it didn't seem wise to tell the condescending guy with a knife that I cheated my way through. I didn't really belong here. "You want to do it or should I?" he asked, holding the knife handle towards me. The wall was shaking so badly now that I could feel a gentle wind wafting from its convulsions. The other student must have noticed that I was frozen with confusion, because he pulled the knife back a moment later. "Fine, but you get the next one. I'm not going to carry you the whole way." He spun and thrust the knife directly in the giant eye on the wall. It clenched shut, lurching and thrashing against him. He grunted and leaned the blade, pushing it even deeper, as blood flowed freely to drench him up to the arm. The flesh was rumbling like a man trying to scream through a mouth that was sewn shut. 5, maybe 10 seconds before the trembling stopped, the boy withdrew the knife to make a few savage slashes until the flesh relinquished its hold on the walls and fell into a heaping mass on the floor. "Guess this is mine now," he said, wiping off the dagger and storing it in his suitcase. He lifted his case a foot off the ground and stepped through the leaking monstrosity on the ground. "You coming or not?" he added. I nodded, but it was nothing more but a reflex. I tried not to look down as I gingerly stepped over the mess on the floor, almost vomiting as I felt it squelch beneath my feet. What have I gotten myself into? He introduced himself as Michael Sulin as we continued. Not the company I would have chosen, but he at least seemed to know what he was doing. I was careful not to ask anything that would betray my ignorance after that, but I was able to pick up a few clues from his idle conversation. Michael didn't know he had demon blood until recently, but he'd suspected there was something different about him since birth. He accidentally watched the original Saw movie when he was 8, and his parents only caught him when they heard how loudly he was laughing. He'd broken his arm skateboarding so badly once that the bone ruptured from his skin, and he spent an hour playing with it before going to the hospital. He even said he felt like he was nocturnal sometimes, describing the night as something which fit him as naturally as second skin. The shrill wailing of an infant broke the conversation. We exchanged glances, his face a mask of greedy excitement, like a child in a candy shop. When we stopped next, there was a closed door blocking the hallway. Wooden this time. At least, although that did nothing to distract from the crying infant placed upon the matching wooden table. He couldn't be more than 2 months old. I picked him up, trying to get him to stop crying. Michael was reading the note. The key is inside. Inside what? I asked. He just smiled. I'm not gonna do that. My response was visceral and immediate. This is sick. The first note just said to go as far as we were able. That means we can stop whenever we want. That means it's a test, Michael corrected, stooping to open his case. He glanced at the dark hallway behind me. I could leave. I could close the door and pretend none of this ever happened. I turned back to see Michael producing the serrated knife, still wet with blood. Leaving wouldn't stop these tragedies, though. I would only enable the school to continue training these monsters. Doubtlessly, preparing them for the worst atrocities yet to come. Maybe that's why Missy led me here. Maybe she wanted me to help her put an end to all of this. We're here because this is the only place for people like us. Might as well get used to it. Michael offered me the knife, and I instinctually shielded the child with my arms, backing away from him. Kill it now! His voice was edged with a sudden intensity. Quick! We give up, I shouted to no one in particular. Whoever is watching, we give up. This is as far as we can go. Elijah, you idiot! Give it to me then. No, I won't let you. Michael lunged at us with the knife, but I managed to scramble out of the way. I lost my balance on the uneven stones and fell straight onto my arse though. I covered the child with my body, but had to let go a moment later, as a piercing pain, like a fistful of needles, was gorging into my hand. The infant had latched onto me with unnatural ferocity. It shouldn't have even had teeth yet, but I could clearly see multiple rows of razor edges burrowing into my skin. I screamed and strained to pull it off, but every movement did nothing but give it a fresh angle to burrow further. Bash it against the wall, Michael shouted. I did so, again and again, beating the tiny body into the stone, feeling the fragile bones inside splinter with every iteration. The grip finally began to slacken, until finally I was able to stomp the tiny creature's body and rip my bloody hands free. It almost looked reptilian where it lay on the ground, its yellow eyes boring into me as they closed to slits. Welcome home, master, croaked the dying monstrosity. Ready now? Michael asked, handing me the knife once more. I didn't hesitate this time. I plunged it straight into chest and tore a long hole straight down into its navel. A hot mess of insides oozed out, and I had to actually dig my fingers into it to retrieve the bronze key. It bled profusely from a dozen puncture wounds. I wrapped it as best I could with one of my extra t-shirts, but I can only imagine what ghastly infections might come from those wounds. I don't know whether it was loss of blood or horror of this place, but I felt so lightheaded that I almost toppled the second I stood upright. Come on now, easy there. I was surprised by the gentleness in Michael's tone as he helped me to my feet. We're in this together, so let's do it right. We both want to get to this school, right? I nodded meekly, allowing him to guide me to the door. Then let's not give up before we have to, he said. I, for one, am looking forward to seeing how far this rabbit hole goes. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. If you are left itching for more of that last story, you're not the only one. I've already reached out to the author to see if he'd be willing to write a part 2, so that we can go further down the rabbit hole. If he does, you can be sure it will be the first story in the next Demonic Stories video. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a big thumbs up and consider subscribing and hit the little bell icon for even more stories every day. All these stories were written by the incredible Tobias Wade. To read more, check out the link in the description to his website to get more of his works. Don't forget that if you would like me to read your story on my channel, you can send it to my email or share it to my Reddit. Both, of course, can be found in the description. Just be sure to include as much punctuation, paragraphing, and description as possible, as this will maximize the chances of it being read. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.